At the beginning, it would be great if we start with your lecture in remarks in mathematics. Then I might have a couple of questions to you, sir. You may start.
Okay, well, I welcome you all here. I must say I was delighted to receive the invitation to attend the USERN Congress. Unfortunately, I'm not able to visit Iran at this time, though I hope sometime to visit. And I'm touched that I've been asked to give a lecture about mathematics. I have to say, for me, it's very difficult to give a lecture in mathematics to non-mathematicians. Some people are very good at it, but I'm not good at it. But at the same time, I was asked to speak about my own life, my own career, and so I'm afraid much of my talk will be about me rather than about mathematics in general. And I will also talk about some of the very interesting people I've met during my long life. I'm now 91 years old. So. Well, it's as you know, mathematics plays a very useful role in many branches of science. Of course, physics and engineering, but also in chemistry, biology, and even economics. So mathematics really enters everywhere, and in particular, when people try to do quantitative analysis of some scientific phenomenon, very often they're expressed in terms of a particular field in mathematics called partial differential equations, and that's the main field in which I work. So these involve functions of more than one space variable, and you involve derivatives of the different variables. And such equations enter really in almost every branch of science. But let me start by talking a little bit about my own life. I was born in Canada, and I went to a very good high school. It was during the Depression, the economic depression, and at that time, to be a teacher in a high school was considered a very good job, and so there were excellent teachers. The high school was called Baron Byng High School. It doesn't exist anymore. In fact, some years ago, a Montreal newspaper published an article about some of the famous people who had been students at that high school. Of course, I was not mentioned among those people. But anyway, it was really, I have wonderful memories of that high school. And then when I graduated, in the high school I should say, my favorite subjects were geometry and physics. In fact, the physics teacher actually had a PhD in physics, which was quite remarkable for a high school teacher. And I was very influenced by him, and I decided I would like to become a physicist. And so when I applied to the local university, McGill University, which is an English language university in Montreal, I applied for a scholarship, but I didn't get it. And luckily, the high school offered an additional year free, which was equivalent to a first year of college. So I attended that year in the high school, and then I entered college in the second year of college, and I only studied mathematics and physics, no other subjects, which I regret because it would have been nice to learn other things, but that's all. I just took courses in mathematics and physics. And at that time, there were no people doing research in those fields at McGill University, except for one person, one mathematician named Gordon Paul, who was a very inspirational teacher. But I decided I would go on physics. And I graduated at McGill just at the end of the Second World War. It was in Europe. It was the spring of 1945. By the way, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions. So that summer, I got a job in National Research Council. They were doing work on atomic physics, and I had a summer job there. And at the same time, working there was a physicist who was a son of Richard Courant, famous mathematician. He was working there, and so was his wife, who was from Montreal, and who I knew before. And one day she said to me, "Oh, we are going to New York to visit Richard Courant for a weekend." I said, "Oh, could you ask him where I might apply to do graduate work in physics?" And they came back and they said, "Courant suggests, why not come to New York University, where he was teaching, get a master's degree in mathematics, and then you might go on to study physics." So I went down for an interview. I was interviewed by Courant and his colleague Kurt Friedrichs, and they offered me an assistantship. And so in the fall of 1945, I came to New York as a graduate student in mathematics, and I never left. My whole career has been at New York University, so I simply never left, and I never left mathematics. So I think I was enormously lucky. In fact, I must say I consider myself a very lucky person. I really think that luck plays a role in one's life, and I really think I've been enormously lucky. So when I arrived at the end of the war in 1945, there were very few students in doing graduate work in mathematics, which was a very small department. And I'll mention names of two of them. One was Peter Lax, who is a famous mathematician. He also won the Abel Prize a few years ago. In fact, 4 people at Courant Institute won the Abel Prize, which is really quite remarkable, I think. And another very good mathematician, an applied mathematician, was Joseph Keller. He died just a few months ago. And he was really a kind of a role model for applied mathematicians. He worked in all kinds of problems, from very simple problems to very complicated problems. He was wonderful at making mathematical models. I think that's a special talent that some mathematicians have, to make good mathematical models. And he investigated problems. For instance, one of the problems he worked on was that when women run, their hair at the back swings not up and down, but from side to side. So he developed a mathematical theory for that. And another time he told me he was working on a theory. He said, "Suppose you are standing in front of some garbage on the street, and, you will pardon the expression, you are urinating on the garbage." He says, "But you have to worry that some bacteria can swim. Maybe they will swim up into your body." So he worked on a theory about that. But he also worked on theory about ship design. He did theory in mathematics itself. He worked on a huge variety of problems. Quite a remarkable guy.
Great job.
And when Courant, I should say a word about Richard Courant. He was, at one time, he was the director of a very famous mathematics institute in Göttingen, Germany. And when the Nazis came to power, he was kicked out. And a year later, he was offered the job in New York University to create a graduate mathematics program. So he came around 1935, if I remember correctly. He was asked when he arrived, "What do you need for a graduate mathematics program?" And he said, "A mathematics library and a coffee room." I hope you have that in your institute in Tehran. And in fact, a new building was put up for what would then be called the Courant Institute around 1965. And we have a wonderful lounge on the top floor where everybody has coffee and has lunch often and meets often. And we have also parties there and celebrations there. It's a very important part of the Courant Institute. I hope you'll visit sometime.
I hope to.
So, also Courant was, he loved to be with young people. enormously encouraging of young students. And he often invited us to his home. He lived in a suburb of New York, and usually there was music played because he loved music, and his wife was an ardent music lover. She played a number of string instruments, and also their two daughters also were very active in music. One of them became a professional musician, and she later married Peter Lax. Unfortunately, she died 2 years ago. In fact, at New York University, the main research person was Kurt Friedrich. He came to New York a few years after Courant, and he was very active, and he was, for me, I must say, my main inspiration in mathematics was him. I consider him my sensei, as the Japanese say, sort of my scientific master. And when I came to choose a thesis, I went to him to suggest a problem on which to work, and he suggested a general field, and I thought about that for several months, but I got nowhere. And then another colleague, James Stoker, then suggested a problem in geometry. This was an old problem that had been worked on by a famous mathematician named Hermann Weyl, who had made some contributions to the problem but did not solve it entirely. And so I worked on that problem, and that involved nonlinear partial differential equations. So that's how I got into that subject. And I must say, through my whole career, all the problems I've worked on, including other fields of mathematics like geometry and complex analysis and fluid dynamics, they all involve partial differential equations. So that's been my main work, my main direction. So I worked on this problem in geometry, and I was able to fill in what Hermann Weyl could not do. I was able to complete what he had done and to solve the problem. Around the same time, a Russian mathematician named Pogorelov also solved the problem. And well, then after getting my degree, I was appointed as a young junior member of the faculty. But I wanted to say a word about the geometric problem. It's a very simple problem to formulate. You're given a two-dimensional sphere, and on it you are given a metric, which is a way of measuring lengths of curves. And it's not the usual normal length of the sphere, but some other way of measuring curves. And associated with such a metric is something called its curvature. And if the thing has positive curvature, you don't know what curvature is, so I apologize. But if it has positive curvature, the problem was, could you realize this surface as a real surface, convex surface in 3 dimensions, having this metric as its natural metric? That was the problem that Weyl had posed, and it led to partial differential equations and eventually to the solution. So the problem was easy to pose. There are lots of still unsolved, many long unsolved problems in mathematics. Perhaps the best known, about 20 years ago, the British mathematician Andrew Wiles, who won the Abel Prize this year, he solved a problem called the Fermat's theorem, which was about 350 years old. And Fermat was the mathematician who had written something on the edge of a book saying, the following thing is true and I have a proof for it, but it's too complicated to write here. And for 350 years, people tried to find a proof of that result. And finally, that was done by Andrew Wiles in the 1990s.
100 years for mathematics is very common to obtained practical using
Yes.
technology, maybe
That's
200.
right. That's right. It can be 100 years. It can be 25 years. You never know. That's right.
در جلوتر ریاضی از جذابتر بود.
I'd like to mention also there were, besides Friedrich, there were two other former students of Courant who had a lot of influence on my work. One was Fritz John, and he was a very extremely talented, but they were both very talented, Fritz John and Hans Levy. Fritz John was a very modest and wonderful mathematician. We wrote one paper together, which many people have quoted. And then Hans Levy, when Hitler came to power, he left Germany immediately. And he moved to Berkeley, and he spent most of his career at the University of California in Berkeley. And a number of my papers grew directly out of work that he had done. And we were very good friends. One of the joys, unexpected joys of being a research mathematician, which I never thought would happen, was international travel. Suddenly I was invited to meet, people were invited to meetings all over the world, and that's been an enormous pleasure because I consider mathematicians as a family, and it's a wonderful family. When I go to another country and I meet mathematicians, I immediately feel at home with them wherever I am. It's a wonderful feeling.
You have one language, one common language.
Yes, a common language, a common
family
point of view.
Point of view.
Yes, it's something quite wonderful. And I was hoping if I visit Tehran that I would meet with some some mathematicians there.
Sir, do you know Maryam Mirzakhani, an Iranian mathematician who won the Fields Medal?
I never met her. She's at Stanford University. I know her name, but I never met her. No, I don't know her. I think she was trained in the United States. Yeah. So, what is this? Yes, I would like to just mention in connection with travel, in 1951-52, I had a scholarship to go to Zurich to spend a year with a famous topologist and geometer named Heinz Hopf. And he was a particularly nice and kind person. It was just wonderful to be with him. He spoke beautiful German, and he was my favorite lecturer for many years. He was a wonderful lecturer. And another wonderful experience I had in 1963, there was a joint American-Soviet meeting in partial differential equations in Siberia, in Novosibirsk. There was an academic town that was created there, and the meeting was held there for 2 weeks. That was my first contact with Soviet mathematicians. There were about 24 American mathematicians and about 120 Soviet mathematicians from all over the Soviet Union. And it was like being on a ship together for 2 weeks. You make friends immediately, and some of these people have remained friends since then, very close friends. I have visited Moscow a number of times, and I see these friends, and some have come to the United States. Unfortunately, some have died, but they were friends that have remained friends all these years. It was a wonderful experience. And as I say, part of the mathematical family. It's just a marvelous family. Yeah. I think perhaps I won't bore you with further.
They're very useful for us. I
don't know if it's useful.
No.
But
May I ask a question?
yes, sure.
What do you think of science without border? A body to validate and distribute scientific resources?
Sorry, I have trouble hearing you. Say it again slowly.
What do you think of science without borders?
Oh, you mean the medical community?
Yes, science without border. All
Oh, I'm a great believer in science without borders, of course. You know, even during the time when there was a lot of tension between the Soviet Union and the US, scientists had very good relations with each other. Although there was a joke that some Russian scientists would say, well, the Americans, they don't read the Russian literature, so they don't know that we already did something, and they don't know it. The Russians were much more attentive to Western literature than the West was to the Soviet literature, I must say. But personally, there was very good communication between scientists. So and that's true with China, and even though there's some tension between the West and U.S. and China, the personal relations are excellent. I had 6 students from China, very good students, and one of them went back when he went to Taiwan. He was from Taiwan, very good mathematician, and I must say these students are like children to me. They're just wonderful students.
And also, how do you think interdisciplinary collaboration has to take part in the future of science? Interdisciplinary collaboration.
Well, I'm all for it. I always, I wanted to be a physicist and never became one, although I have enormous admiration for physicists, and I always felt I would be very happy if something I did was useful to somebody. So I'm all for a collaboration between different scientists, of course. But I think all scientists are, so I'm not unique in that way. I want to mention I had a very talented student named August Newlander, and I heard about a problem in complex analysis in higher dimensions from a famous mathematician named Andre Weil, and at one point he said, "Why aren't you people in PD working on this basic problem? It's an important problem in complex analysis." And so I thought, well, why not? I'll try. And so with this student, I said, let us look at the very simplest case, and in the lowest dimension, 2 complex dimensions. Let's look at that case. And he had the first idea, how to solve that case. So he did that, and then we could do the general case in 2 complex dimensions, and then we discovered to our dismay that it didn't work in higher dimensions. The method just didn't work. But we found, eventually we came up with a completely different proof. And so that worked fine. And I would like to add one other thing, that some mathematicians, when they're working on something and they come to a fork in the road, they take it. And I'm one of those mathematicians. Very often I'm working with somebody and I say, hey, that looks interesting. Let's explore that. And then we drop what we're doing and we explore that. It may lead to something, it may not. We may never return to the original problem. But anyway, we're always tempted. We see something interesting. Another thing about mathematics, you solve a problem and the problem leads to new questions. Almost invariably, it leads to some new questions. Yeah. That's one of the wonders of mathematics. There are always new questions coming up. It's such a pleasure to do research in mathematics. It's such a joy, such fun. Fun is really the right word. It's enormous fun to do research in mathematics. But I'm sure that's true in every science. I'm sure the 3 of you have fun in what you are doing.
Yeah. So we don't want to...
But in mathematics, people are stuck most of the time. most of the time you get nowhere. You're just stuck. You don't have an idea. You try something, it doesn't work. And then perhaps, if you're lucky, then something develops and you suddenly...
I want to ask a question about this. Another question that pops into mind is the mental status of yours and motivations that made you come along this far to the top of your field. What made you to bear the difficulties in such persistence? This question is for students like me who are facing daily problems and issues and might think of giving up.
It's a good question. First of all, what you need in mathematics, as I'm sure in every science, is perseverance. You have to be stubborn.
Can I turn on some light?
Sorry.
Turn on some light.
No, you can put that light on. Just a minute. No, that light is. I'll put on. The switch is there. I'll do it. That's okay. Is that help?
Yes.
There's a light there, but that light will interfere, I think.
Yeah, this is good. This is good. Yeah. Can we plug in to somewhere?
Yes. The question is where.
There's no.
What is it?
It's the charger.
Oh, charger.
There's no room for them? A charger into a plug. Where is the plug? Yes, it's...
A charger. He has to charge his something.
Okay, it's...
We did it. We did it.
Solved.
You found it?
Yeah, we found it.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's okay, Nanette. We found it. I have to say that in connection with your question, some years ago, a graduate student asked me, how do you think of problems to work on? And that's a good question, except I don't have a good answer. I don't really know how I think of problems, but I did tell him one way that I have found is that sometimes I see a proof that I don't like. Somebody has proved a result, and I don't like the proof. And so I start thinking there must be a more natural proof. And so I start thinking about that, and sometimes it leads to some new mathematics. And the student said, I never saw a proof I didn't like. So I thought, he's hopeless. The student, if he ever saw a proof he didn't like. Let me see what else I have here.
So your suggestion for this kind of students who want to giving up is to don't give up. What's your own motivation in your scientific career?
Well, I don't know how to explain what problems I like or what problems I must say there's such a thing as taste in mathematics. Some people have very good taste in the kind of problems they choose. For example, Peter Lax, I mentioned a colleague, he has wonderful taste in his problems. He has, and I don't quite know how to describe this, but somehow it's there. And how to choose problems, I don't know how to explain it. Sometimes I think of a problem, I think, oh, that's an interesting problem, I'll think about it. Or very often, I hear a problem that people have tried to solve. In fact, there are two kinds of mathematicians. There are those who develop general theories, and those who are problem solvers. And I'm a problem solver, primarily. And maybe I'll conclude by telling a story that a couple of years ago at a party I was talking with the wife of a mathematician, and she was telling me about their daughter, a 29-year-old woman, and she said to me, can you introduce her to some young mathematician? And I said, well, what does she do? And she's a lawyer. I said, well, surely she must meet some young lawyers. And she said, yes, she does, but I would like her to marry a mathematician because they are such nice people. And
Sure.
I think mainly mathematicians are very nice people.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, once I was reading an article in a magazine about a conductor and composer named Andrei Previn. And I found the article very charming, and I found him very charming. And so I told my wife, oh, you should read this article. It's a very interesting man. And so she read the article, and I said, what do you think? Did you like him? And she said, no, he's just like a mathematician. So I think maybe I stop now.
Yeah, thank you.